Next up, we are very fortunate to have this session on place Ramallah. Dream, memory, or reality? What unique perspectives can the visitor, the exile, the expatriate, and the local resident each offers on what it means to encounter, belong, or lament somewhere, someplace? What is the best way to traverse it? By running? By leaving? Can you capture it in words and images? What is the Ramallah Syndrome? What sound does it make? What do you remember? First off, an apology because our esteemed guest, Maroud Barghouti, is not able to be with us for family reasons. However, we have the rest of our excellent crew. We have Shuruq Harb on the far left, and Shuruq is a visual artist and curator and writer based in Ramallah. She's the co-founder of Art Territories, which is an online publishing platform dedicated to art and visual culture. And in the middle here is Guy Mannes-Abbott, who's a writer, essayist, and critic. He recently published In Ramallah Running, which is a series, the latest series in his career of producing texts, poems, aphorisms, which are collectively called E-Things, which he's been making since the late 1990s. And they will be in discussion with our very own Shumon Basar. So please welcome our guests.
I'm running in Ramallah, running through, around, and on Ramallah, hill of God, God of hills, running almost 1,000 meters above Mediterranean sea level, almost 1,000 feet further above Dead Sea level, running on the 7 hills that Ramallah is said, with radical understatement, to inhabit. Everything in Ramallah is a hill or hills, in apparent infinity, up and down and up. Sharply, severely, steeply, gently, deceptively, constantly. Everything between hills is becoming Ramallah, spreading, forging, declaiming the old and new, for now, forever. Running connotes residence, a home being run from or to one nearby. I'm making Ramallah homely by running here, leaving some of myself out there, drawing into myself whatever is here, shortening and lengthening my time. Running is a proof of my existence, my proof that, as the poet wrote, I exist. The essence of running involves exerting yourself to the fullest within your individual limits, which is also a metaphor for life, according to the novelist. It doesn't sound like much until you do it. Running in Ramallah, I encounter things that are contradictory, even conflicting, but little I could describe as paradoxical. Despite its sweetly sophisticated humors, this is not a place that can afford paradox. I'm running in Ramallah, and it is painful. I'm in Ramallah, but not for long. Running extends my residency. It works slowly by taking me to places I would not otherwise go, repeatedly. It works fast by taking me to many places as quickly as Google, but concretely. I've been there, been back, and can go again in no time. Running discourages thinking or conclusion, concentrates on the present. The present is what is, how things are for now. I'm running in the present and peculiarly alive to the details of what is around me. Running down, I pass teams of builders arriving on site. I run out on the main road into yellow taxi buses or servies, UN-badged 4x4s, mothers driving children to school, and again on our return loops. Running through Batn al-Hawa, the road is up. Work not underway until I return, an object of mirth, recognition, and warm encouragement. Westerly panoramas once began here, but the view is now of trench work and substrata. The spraying of sticky tarmac one day, a smooth new surface another. At the end is Zaman, beacon of uptown Ramallah, which opens at downtown hours, but their coffee is weak, expensive. On Deluxe Altira Street, I settle into my rhythm and watch police guards changing shifts along the newly mansioned ridge, which leads to the city's northwest extremity. I pass them standing armed in groups of 4 at junctions along the way, offer greetings, share smiles. Passing me, they do the same. When I reach the city's new panoramas at the end of the ridge today, 4 soldiers stand guard with muscles, big guns, and a matching jeep. We amuse each other before I step aside to look out myself, begin to run back into town. Overtaking me on Altira's incline, each waves an individual greeting to the cliché I embody, the joke that I get, the ambiguity of the fact that it is me that is running. When I'm not running, I'm thinking. Details stack up. The present acquires depth and dimension. Things become complex. They change. Everything. I am one of very few people in Ramallah who can prove their existence merely by running in the hills. One of few here who don't need to exert themselves to the utmost just to prove that they exist. I'm the only person I see who is running in Ramallah.
That's a short excerpt from a longer, from a piece Guy has written, which is also eponymously the name of the book which has come out in the last few months in Ramallah, running. And actually, this book, this project, actually even the text was the inspiration for us to nominate place as a term, as a word that perhaps all of us think we might know what it means, but to then kind of subject it to a new form of scrutiny when we put that word place in relation to a specific place. So today is place Ramallah, tomorrow will be place Lagos. And I think the things that maybe they have, the one thing that they have in common, maybe they have many, many things in common, but I think the one thing they have in common, and the thing we wanted to sort of explore in these sessions, is what it means to write, speak, represent places that in one way or another possess a certain difficulty. That difficulty might be political, might be historical, it might be merely difficult in the Kulhazian sense of bigness. Lagos is one of the biggest, fastest growing cities in the world. That poses a certain difficulty of conceptualization, of measurement. So today we're talking about place Ramallah. And perhaps my first question to you, Guy, is the title, In Ramallah Running. You literally ran, but you also are using this as a kind of literary ruse. Could you say something about running in Ramallah before we get to perhaps a more kind of familiar literary form of movement, which is walking?
Yeah, the texts alternate between running and walking texts. And as you will have just heard, the running texts are quite, glancing, and they accumulate a little bit. But whereas the walking texts are a little more detailed, and I ran within the limits of Ramallah, excuse me, sorry, and then walked out beyond the limits to the other limits, discovered what that means to some extent, walked off limits, beyond limits, and back. And of course, what you discover after a while is that the limits are within you, and that's how occupation works. I mean, they're ambiguous and fluid. Ramallah is not a place. Well, there's several reasons why you don't kind of go running in Ramallah. I mean, it's sort of obvious to anyone who's from Ramallah. But the reason it worked for me was to do what I sort of adverting to there, that you can quickly get a little inside some of the intimate everydayness of the city. I mean, essentially that's it. And then go again very quickly, and very quickly again. And so there's a sort of strange intimacy that offered me, actually. And I quite like the fact that my sweat is literally, on the ground. I'm sort of earning it by physical effort.
I mean, this is something that, there's a history of this in your practice as a writer, also as a perambulator. From the moment we've known each other, some 12, 13, 14 years, there were a number of texts that you did in London, which involved you drawing certain lines on the map of London, and then attempting, to your best capability, to walk that line, to record that line, and then, in a sense, to narrate those movements, those incisions. Walking movement in London seems relatively harmless. I'm wondering, presumably, some of these actions that seem harmless in one place take on a different register in a place like Ramallah and Palestine.
Yeah, well, some of that involves a certain degree of foolishness, because I did know and do know people in Ramallah and Palestine, but I wanted to try to encounter the place as nakedly as possible, by literally just walking out and seeing what happened and seeing how far you can go. And no one can really tell you that, because the limits are constantly shifting, for one thing. Yeah, I mean, for example, I was trying to see whether in Ramallah there's a famous, I suppose, settlement that you can see from most places in Ramallah, in Al-Bireh, which looks down on the city and was where tanks fired down from the city 10 years ago. I wanted to know what happened on the other side, and technically that's Area C, which we'll talk about in more detail, but it's sort of, one is not encouraged to go there, let's say. You know, you do this knowing the history of killings on a regular basis there. Whilst I was there, a 14-year-old boy was shot on the road that I crossed, for example, and it's a constant fact of life. But so it's a long story actually, and it's best encountered in the book. But the short version would be to say that I managed to walk around behind there. Someone stopped me, and they sent me up to security in the settlement. And as I was going up there, I thought, I've only got one chance of this. I've got to try and get up on the hill, which I did, and was very, very aware of my mortality as I walked up the hill, because you don't know, anything can happen. At the top of the hill, there are a couple of sniper positions, for example. And this is what you mean, isn't it? About you know, it's just a stroll. There are deer running around on the hill. There's you know, flowers on the hill. And at the same time, there's a settlement over there with people who, if I had a darker skin, would probably have already shot me. I mean, that's the reality. And
well, I was struck. That was an email you sent to me. I remember. I mean, you did for a while every day you would write to me in an email and describe the nature of the walk that you made, either that day or the day before. And there was a very chilling line, which was where you described, I think, climbing over and working on to a certain road, and then you said to me, you imagined if I had done that with my coloured skin, the consequences could have been different. Yeah, yeah. Which I thought was really interesting. Shuruq, you prefer to walk, and walk slowly in Ramallah. Is that true?
Yes. Yes, because it's really small. And anybody who's been there knows that it's surrounded by checkpoints. So the parameters of make the city are quite limited. And so in order to kind of feel like maybe the place is bigger, I always walk. I don't even drive. But just to kind of have that illusion of more time, more space. Yeah.
I know I'm gonna ask you in a minute to sort of bring us up to speed a little bit about Ramallah's the recent history and the things that have made it what it is now. But just in statistics, do you know how big is Ramallah in terms of population? Is it?
I was so worried you would ask me a question that I wouldn't know, and I'm terrible with numbers, so I don't know.
But you also said that it's when one says Ramallah, it's a town, a city, but also a constellation of villages around it. So is it fair to say it's not necessarily a city? Is it a region? Like, how would you designate it?
No, it is a city. But the idea about Ramallah being what it is right now is what people are talking about specifically is the city. And it's very small. It's the area that was early on designated as Area A, where the Palestinian Authority both rules security-wise, but also civil life. And that's quite small, but I mean, Ramallah is a city that has villages. But often people forget that and they concentrate on the city as a city and some of like the contradictions that it has become to embody. Mainly that it looks somewhat normal. There's a lot of construction that looks somehow that it's imitating Dubai or Amman. It's trying really hard to assert itself as a city, and this has become kind of like the phenomena of what Ramallah is. And they kind of forget all of the things that are happening on the outskirts, partly also because the conditions of the outskirts are quite different, as you were saying. Like Area C is the area that's designated as Israeli security, and the PA doesn't have any authority over those areas. So the conditions are very different, even though the distances are short.
If you were to walk from one end of what you consider to be Ramallah to the other end, how long would that walk take, do you think?
If I'm walking medium speed, I think an hour and a half, which is not really that much. I mean,
and Guy, how long were your perambulations per day? Did they vary in length?
They did a bit, depending on how far. For example, if you go from old Ramallah, say, down to Rafat, it's 5 kilometers, so that takes minutes. But on other days, I walked out. Ramallah is in the center of Ramallah district, right? So, which is a large area with many villages, some of whom depend a little on coming into Ramallah to sell produce and things. So I walked for, maybe for 4 or 5 hours, maybe, some days, and then get on the bus and come into town with people coming in with wild sage, say, and other things. And you accumulate an impression of the city from outside like that. You could describe it as eventually getting a kind of archipelago of views without, and I mean it as it were literally, not theoretically as a term, you know.
So Shuruq, you've brought some pictures from a couple of decades ago,
yes.
1988. So.
Yeah. Well, these are pictures that I came across quite recently, but I felt it was appropriate to show them here. They're pictures by Thomas Hartwell, who's a photographer, who photographed the Palestinian Authority in 1998 for the World Bank. And I thought they were appropriate to start with because they start with Oslo. And in the beginning of the 90s, Oslo in the Palestinian context no longer just means a Norwegian city, but it becomes a political reality. Yeah, and what this political reality determines, it's something that we still struggle with today, but also it is what creates Ramallah as it is today, the phenomena of Ramallah being like this alternative capital, a bizarre, enormously, the place in which the state is most visible. So these are just some of the things that were happening in 1998 at the start of the Palestinian Authority. They look normal, but these were quite phenomenal at the time, that we would have Palestinian license plates, that we'd have an airport, even though it didn't function and there were no airplanes. But all of these ideas of, having some kind of, how do you say it? Not authority, self-governing, yeah. We started to have police, and it was a bit confusing because the police looked exactly like the Israeli police. And in fact, actually, in many ways, they started to police us for Israel. So you can imagine the confusion. But also even, this was the beginning of when we started to have big billboards and advertisements for mobile companies, which actually never existed before this moment. Mail system, which is completely absurd because the mail has to go through Israel. And if you've ever tried to send anything to Palestinian territories, you know it's never going to get there. And a TV. But yeah, all of these things, roads, TV, all of these, seemingly structures that give you the state, but while actually in actuality, the state was never going to happen. This is just a very useful map that I find. For those of you who are familiar with Palestine, you probably have seen it, but it just kind of illustrates how this Oslo process really fragmented Palestine. And as a result, we started to speak about places as individual locations. So Ramallah becomes a syndrome of its own. Hebron is a different syndrome. The village, you know, at Dahriya, like where my grandparents are from, is a totally different syndrome. So this is basically the fragmentation of what Palestine is. This is an actual picture from 1998. Unfortunately, it still looks the same, but this was the beginning of the absurdity that only after years later that we began to realize. The above is a bypass road for Israeli settlers. And basically the way that the occupation and the Oslo process divided the landscape is that you had these two parallel realities that never met. And which also makes the idea of Palestine as a state almost impossible and very absurd in terms of a landscape.
Perhaps we could move on to your project with the road signs.
Yeah, so in moving forward, 2005, at the time, the municipality of Ramallah, which more and more tries to keep up this facade of normalcy and the alternative capital, in a way, began a project of renaming the streets and putting up street signs, which was quite new. And I really liked the phenomena as a visual phenomena because a lot of what they did also was put the bios of the people that they were naming the streets after. And when I looked at the collection as a whole, it was interesting because it really reflected a lot about what Ramallah was trying to be. The list contained Palestinian resistance fighters, important politicians, some people from the Islamic era, other Christian important figures, but also people like Picasso and Freud. And basically what this all meant, or what Ramallah tries to be, it tries to be a Christian and a Muslim city. It wants to be still affiliated with some kind of notion of Palestinian resistance, but at the same time, it wants to be a cultural capital, a capital or a place that also relates to other people. And that's how I read it. And what I thought would be funny was to collect all the names of the people, because often you name streets after people who are dead. And I thought it would be interesting to have them all as some kind of registry. And I put them according to their date of birth. And I just have a short video that I'll just show. Because at the same time, what was being erased was how people identified the city as well. And one way, the head of the committee who did this project was very passionate about it because he felt it was a way to make history visible. And almost it was educational for the people to understand what your city is about and how it's supposed to project itself. But the reality on the ground was quite different. And I just want to show you, this is like a very short clip. Do you know the name of the street that you live on?
No.
اسامي شوارع ما نعرفش
ولا شارع طبرية
ولا شيء
ولا شارع عمان
شارع توفي بقى
يعني دوار المنارة لما بصير دوار ياسر عرفات فتغير فبطل معلم من معالم رام الله الأصلي وهو معلم حلو يعني احنا نفتخر انه في اشي لقيادتنا الفلسطينية بس بنفس الوقت احنا اولاد البلد صفينا تايهين
ولينا كل فخر ان الاسامي دي بقت شهداء للثورة الفلسطينية وإلهم باع طويل في الثورة الفلسطينية وإلهم بصمات اذا كانوا شعراء او اذا كانوا مناضلين او اذا كانوا مؤسسين فطبعا احنا طبعا ما ننساش يعني دورهم يعني
بس غيروا باسماء. هيو هذا شارع المعلم جريس. انو معلم جريس ما حدا عارفه. هذا الشارع اللي مين اللي علم جريس؟ ولو كاتبين نبذه عنه بدك يعني جيل جيلين لما يفهم عنه شيء.
I saw the very funny one when I was going to Snowber. It's called the street Jacques Chirac because it was spelled like American way, so he's so French, you know, so that's why.
أنا بقول لهم يا إما تسأل وين بيت أبو سفيان بندلوا، هذه واحدة. الشيء الثاني شارع البلدية القديمة أو شارع الحسبة، بندلوا الناس يعني بيعرفوا بعض هون. ما هي هذه البلد القديمة صارت زي المقبرة، بيجيهاش إلا اللي قاصدها.
I will tell you go until, for example, Café de la Paix or Café de la Paix. You will cross. You have the hotel, and I will give you some name of places. Never streets, no, never.
Wanted to say two more things. On one level, I am a little bit cynical about the whole naming project, but I do find it interesting because in a way, I think the way that you define a place is always through people. And so that's on one level what the municipality was doing, but also the way that people, I mean, it's kind of sad that they kind of overrode the notion of place for the people who actually live there. It would have been amazing if they actually were more creative about the whole issue of naming.
How, your project is there permanently?
Ironically, when I put it initially, I put it in front of the municipality because I thought it would be another way of kind of, you know, poking fun at them. They were really proud and both confused. And it was right next to an information center that was just about to be launched. And when the Prime Minister came, apparently my sign was blocking his view. So they removed it without even telling me. I was just walking by the next day and it was gone. And that was the explanation that I was given, yeah.
You have an interest in names. There's the book of Muhammad, for example. Could you say something about that and we could talk about that?
It's actually a book of signatures. But yeah, I am kind of fascinated with names, although I'm pretty bad at remembering them. But yeah, I mean, that project was a way of kind of identifying the place through a network of people. I came to realize through statistics that Muhammad was the most popular name in Palestine. So I decided to go around the city of Ramallah and collect signatures of people who are called Muhammad, and each Muhammad would lead me to other Muhammads. And I spent a few months doing that, but it was quite interesting because it gave me access to a lot of places that I wouldn't have otherwise had to. I went with teenagers to their houses. I went into the Ministry of Economy or Business, I don't remember, until they got rid of me. And the Ministry of Interior as well. I got to know bakeries that I didn't know, you know, good vegetable shops. And I got to see the connections between people. So it was a nice way of kind of getting around the city, you know, through people.
I like that because it's reminding me of something. Friends of mine recently had a baby girl, and Guy knows this predicament very well. They could not decide on a name for her, and of course they thought, well, we'll wait until he or she, they didn't know the sex, so that's one thing, until they are in the world, and somehow they will tell us what they should be named. Exactly. But once the girl was born, it didn't prompt anything immediate. So the baby girl remained unnamed for a week, maybe 2 weeks. I found this extraordinary and extraordinarily strange because this idea of being in the world and not having a name. If we suggested yesterday that you're only real if you have a Wikipedia page about you, in the pre-21st century, you're only real if you had a name. One of the characteristics of slavery was to not name, right? Or name in such a way that the name was not a name. And weirdly enough, the road system here in Dubai traditionally has not used names. They're beginning to change this. But it leads to incredible confusion. I live on road 63B/1, you know, this kind of strange numerical matrix. And so I wonder if you would agree that can a place be a place until it has names attached to it?
Oh, the history of that's you know, appalling, isn't it? I'm going to read something that refers to that, but because these signs were paid for by US aid as just the latest colonial project. So yes, places definitely can exist without a name, I think.
Without names?
Yes, for sure. Because places place, you know, they long.
So in that sense, they're different to people. I mean, can a person exist without a name?
All of my children did until we called them Jacques Chirac, which has been a source of
That's the middle
confusion
name.
ever since. Yeah. Well, there is a story. I mean, since you brought up the subject of children's names, when my first child was born, I had some friends in India. I was in India a lot, and for the year that their child had been born, and I would sometimes drop back, and whilst, it's a long story, but the short version of this is that they just called it baby. And I loved them for that, because we were caught up in a legal issue around the name that we'd given my son, Elba. And the day that the Swedish newspaper, I'm not Swedish, but my partner is, decided that to change the law so that he could be called Elba was the last time I went back to see Baby. And Baby was still called Baby, and in Sweden they'd finally said, let the boy be called Elba after 3 years. So, I mean, it's absurd. So yes, people can, I don't like names in a sense. You know.
Do you have another reading for us?
Yeah.
Could you,
sure.
That relates to the road sign?
Very directly, actually, to this. Maybe I would just say one thing, which is just that the running thing was I decided the furthest you could run, or I could run, was to run out to the end of the new development, which is George Abash Square. So that's where I was running to George Abash Square, who's a famously uncompromising figure in the history of Palestinian politics. In Ramallah, running... Oh, sorry, let me just make sure I've got the right thing here. I had the wrong thing. Okay. In Ramallah, I'm running within bodily limits, the muscular fruits of midnight runs along the river in central London. Here I run from the centre to its limits as far as I'm able. Within my limits means running for twice as long, if not twice as far, as in London. Ramallah is small, and so am I. I'm running within the limits of what I understand, of what I can see in Ramallah. I pass Edward Said Street, which is easy, though repeatedly Mahmoud regrets its modest scale. Down past Al-Raja, or Hope Street, which is less easy, but surely always involves the same deal. In any case, I keep running far beyond Hope Street and back again. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, the novelist points out. Whether or not you can stand anymore is up to the runner herself. Running takes me places I would not otherwise go, past the end of Rachel Corey Street, for example. It takes me along the ridge past the beginnings of Dalal, Mughrabi, Nile, and Nativity Streets, and out to George Abash Square. On my return, I concentrate on the writers who seem even more arbitrarily heralded in this way, streets named after Lorca and Louis Aragon, for example. I circle back to Edward Said Street, just as I did to him and his work. In Ramallah, nobody recognizes or cares about Al-Jihad Street, or the tarmac of George Abash Square. The game of naming is the oldest colonial trick, paid for this time by US aid. Yet seeing the names going up intrigues me in ways that seeing traditional stone houses or refugee apartments take on a number does not. Stories of love or hate attached to names in ways that they don't to the number 21 or 118. There's one footnote in my text, which was this, that numbers of that kind do mean something very particular in Palestine, 48, 67, etc. But I mean this in this local sense. Everyone here blames occupation and official Palestinian weakness for the cancelled memorializing of Dalal Mughrabi Square. The same apparently happened with George Abash Square. Perhaps I've seen the name on a map. Walking or climbing the final steep stretch home, habit etching residence in these hills, I understand better an elliptical phrase of the novelist's. Long-term projects, he wrote, involve both concentrated focus and endurance. They involve continuing to breathe while holding your breath. Impossible seeming, it might be a potent enough paradox for how Ramallah is, at least for now. In Ramallah, running to the last, I reach my physical limits. Running concentrates a sharp pain in my left calf muscle, strained in a distant wadi 2 days ago. Blissed out, I'd looked up from the terrace to breathe in the contoured rhythms and tripped on a loose rock. I winced and walked on for miles with only a badly grazed boot. Running is something else, but I confront growing pain with even strides and calm constancy. What did the novelist say about pain and suffering? It's a hard run along Al Tireh, but I keep going to the end. and there it is. Running in Ramallah has bound me to the place and set me against notions of space. Place is worn, freighted, complex. Space is seductive, abstract, dust-free. I'm running in an actual place, which is how I knew that Georgia Bush Square exists. Many believe the sign has been removed, disallowed, banned, but here it is. No one surrendered. It's not marked on any map I own, except where I've written it myself. I half ran out here, and there it was, standing up against the settlements in the Palestinian hills. Square George Habash, it reads. Since there's no G as such in Arabic, it's got two J sounds. It's me that is running. In Ramallah, running doesn't dissolve the pain, but heightens and hardens it. I struggled to limp most of the way back, past the guards and Dal al-Maghrabi Street, but at least I get to pay witness. At the end of the ridge this morning, it was clear enough to see Jaffa beyond Bilain and the vast white cities below. It's almost as distinct as the view from Deir Hassana in the north, on the hill where their shaheeds are honored. Words matter everywhere. Walking in Nablus, I admired the spontaneous memorials which have turned into a bureaucratic process in Ramallah. That is, a rehearsal for nationhood. Funny how a sign at George Habash Square is meaningless until it no longer exists. Funny again, altogether, in the coming Palestine.
So I want us to now kind of zoom in on this word place. And you suggested there that it needs to be differentiated critically with nuance from the notion of space.
Huh.
I would put forward perhaps the proposition that the occupation sees this surface of earth, this volume of air, as space, primarily. Yeah. And that's why that amazing picture that Shuruq showed of this stratified kind of, this stratified condition of the settlements, always taking the promontory space, the highest level, having their own road systems, and leaving the Palestinians lower down. So this separation, which is inscribed also in a particular proposition for how to deal with the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, right? But if the occupation perceives this surface, this volume, as space, and uses that, and in terms of naming it, uses the language of space almost, and when I say space, I mean Euclidean, the language of geometry, A, B, C, E1, etc. Place does something else. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big, complex issue, and it's easy to make theoretical or poetic remarks, around the fact that this space is a prison. Actually, it's an open-air prison where everything is controlled by the occupation, from the water to the air. And similarly with Gaza, I think it's 13 kilometers. Where there are destroyers pointing at Gaza and the sea. So, and also I should just clarify that in Ramallah district, similarly as with around Nablus, the villagers do come into town, but they have to negotiate this massive infrastructure everywhere. So it's not a simple or easy thing, but there was that kind of economy, and there still is in some sense. I mean, that's why I mentioned it. I wanted to write about place because it's a way of kind of undermining these notions of space and the abstractions of space, and not engage them directly, and partly to not, but of course this is a luxury I have, not being caught in it, but also partly to literally put into English descriptions of the place as such, because in English you never ever hear about the villages and the wadi in between, and this is something that doesn't really exist more or less in English. So that for me was really important in the project. And I do think that writing about place, or focusing on place, which is common, it's the commons essentially, and its common ground is quite a radical and undermining thing to attempt to do. That's all. It's the future. It's the past, and it's also the future, I think. Whereas this space requires a whole bunch of abstract, particular conditions to continue to exist. And I'm more optimistic, but again, I can afford to be perhaps than you, I think, about how long that can continue to exist.
Shuruq, when you hear the word place, what does it make you? What are your initial kind of things that you think about? And then when you think about place in and of Ramallah?
I always think about place, about people.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's really about people. Yeah, and I think that's kind of how most of my work is directed. I think about it not in a physical way. I think about it as the places of connections. Yeah, and about creating a space, not in the space sense, but creating an alternative, creating resistance. That's how I think about place. But also, I mean, maybe to go back to the beginning, part of when I was growing up, I grew up during this period. I was a teenager in the late 1990s. And a lot of why I liked to walk was because I could imagine other places. And I think in the context of Ramallah and Palestine in general, because it is a prison, it becomes really important to imagine other places. And though I am cynical about the naming thing, but it is a very, literal way of making connections to other places. And I mean, if I want to think about the future and I want to think about place, I would like to think about a future where Ramallah as a place becomes accessible to the rest of the region. I would like somehow for Palestine to be back in the region as a place instead of secluded and physically dissected.
I would like us to. It's unfortunate Murid cannot join us today, but Murid, someone I met through you, Guy. Perhaps without wanting to ask you to, in any way, attempt to summon his spirit, embody him. Could you say something about why Murid Barghouti, as a writer, has been important for the discourse of Palestine, but also to you as a writer, approaching this subject, this place?
Ooh, I'm so glad you spontaneously came up with that. Well, I mean, I can only talk about Murid's work in English. There's only a certain amount of poetry published in English, and then the two memoirs, I Saw Ramallah, and I Was Born There, I Was Born Here. But I mean, some of the poetry, as you may know, is kind of concrete poetry, and he's really good at focusing in on, on the pillow. There's a poem called "The Pillow," which is about the pillow. It doesn't. You don't need to encounter the person whose pillow it was to have encountered their tears or their dreams or their sleep. He does that, and I really admire that. There's poems. I remember there's one. I won't remember the name of it, which is essentially a poem about Muhammad who isn't coming home. Quite a long poem, and I remember reading it thinking, who is this? It must be someone particular, and I couldn't work out who it was. And eventually, I realized it must be Muhammad al-Dura, who was, killed famously in September 2000. But I like the fact that he doesn't nominate. And you need to know something, but somehow that all of there's this huge amount of stuff going on in that poem. For instance, when it comes to the memoir, I'm not sure I could really talk about relative importance of. To be honest,
to you, perhaps.
Oh, to me. Well, he's just a really good writer. I mean, that's the main thing. Those memoirs are as good as it gets. Absolutely. If there's any one person in the room who hasn't read, particularly I Saw Ramallah, please go and give yourself a treat, because it's highly condensed writing. The first chapter is about, after 30 years crossing the bridge across from Jordan. And he evokes that bridge in very, very particular ways. So the creakingness of the bridge, plus all of the bridges in the world and in time, and all of the other feet that have and should have crossed that bridge in a way that's very rare. So
And Shuruq, when I saw Ramallah came out, do you remember that? Did you read it when it came out, or when did you encounter it?
No, I didn't read it when it came out. I read it later. But when I read it, it was... And I'm glad, actually, that I read it later. I don't think I would have been able to digest it. When I read it later, I was so impressed by his precision and his ability to actually see what was going on. Because something that characterizes that period is the confusion, you know. This looks quite clear now, but living through it was very confusing. And I really like the way that he's able to talk about politics and poetry and people simultaneously. And I really like the simplicity of his writing. That's something that I really admire, yeah.
There's also quite a lot of self-critique in it, isn't there? Which is really admirable. I mean, for example, around Qadura camp, I mean just a general... Yeah, he's self-critical of himself and his, and even Palestinian, you know, history, recent history.
Sure. Earlier you mentioned a book called Blonde Ramallah, and that's caused a certain stir. Could you say something about that?
In Arabic, it's called Ramallah Shaqra. I don't know if Blonde Ramallah is the exact translation. But it was written quite recently by a young guy who's, I think, from a village either in the north, but a student or somebody who's working now in Ramallah. And he was being very critical of the Ramallah scene, you know, with all of its normalcy, with all of its partying, with all of its complicity with aid, but it's quite unique in the sense it's been labeled by a lot of the writers as a trashy novel and not well written because he's quite young and he's managed to kind of, you know, put himself on the scene. But I think it's valuable in the sense of I think it's the first time about this phenomena from an outside perspective, not being able to have access. I mean, this Ramallah Syndrome, which I hate speaking about it as a syndrome, it is of a particular class and it is of a very particular condition. So to have somebody writing about these things, not from the perspective of an insider, but somebody who's trying to be inside is, I think, interesting.
Actually, I'm just suddenly reminded of something that Oscar Guardiola Rivera said in his introduction yesterday to Middle East nervous anxiety, which is growing up in Colombia, one of the first faces that he recognized. There were two, but one was Yasser Arafat. And then I'm wondering whether, because as I say, often places require embodiment through whether it's literature or cinema or music to, as it were, kind of fully manifest to the world in a way. But when it comes to Palestine, for a place that has no statehood as such or national recognition, has an incredible ecology of imagery and of individuals and of events, historical events, whether they're contested ones like hijackings and so on and so forth. And one could argue that these are the kinds of representations that one associates, or many people associate with Palestine. So, would it be true to say then that if a place needs its images and it needs its words, does Palestine still need its literature, its cinema, not necessarily to counterbalance those things, but to continue? I mean, you mentioned earlier this business. You're a rabid optimist. You saying, I want to imagine 10 years, 20 years from here, and that these things, I want to imagine as if they do not exist anymore. It seems to me art or literature are spaces, few of the spaces where these things can happen.
Yeah. And because, you know, I mean, I'm just very conscious that the place as a word links to no place very directly, and I think it's worth having that in mind at all times, so that the topic is utopic at the same time, and it's it's alive in that sense, I think. And so, I mean, I don't think I'm being romantic about it, but I want to constantly insist that this is a temporary phenomenon. It's abstract, it's spatial, and I'm more interested in the placial in that sense. That, yeah, things change. It takes a very long time, and things change very rapidly and radically, don't they? Sometimes. So that's what I mean. In that sense, I'm a radical optimist.
And Shuruq, as someone, you said earlier, someone obviously who lives in the place, you don't necessarily read the literature of the place.
Yeah, I mean, well, or maybe I read it in a different way. I mean, I'm not obsessed about reading things strictly about Ramallah, but I guess in terms of visualization and literature and art in general, I mean, the images that you described first, you know, of Arafat and the hijacking and the throne stowing and all that sort of thing, in a way that's so much more simpler than like creating alternative images for that is so much easier than I think the task that we have right now, which is much more complicated because the occupation is internalized. So you and yourself becomes the place of the occupation. So I think in that way, art and creating visuals and literature becomes more and more important because you're trying to get an understanding of what's happening to you. You're trying to bring all of this, in a sense, to articulation, and I think it's important to do.
Shuruq, I was wondering if you can tell us more about the artwork that's done in Palestine that kind of challenges the whole occupation idea, because like there will be an exhibition at the Venice Biennale with two artists who live abroad, and they're trying to particularly focus on imagining different ideas of space from abroad and looking at their country from a different perspective. But what about the artists living in Palestine, and what's the art scene like?
But, I mean, I cannot comment on the Venice thing.
Yeah.
One of them is a friend of mine, but I honestly don't know enough. I can just say I think it's going to be interesting. I don't really like this division about Palestinian artists living inside or abroad. For me, I always identified the Palestinian scene as being quite big, in the sense it involves Palestinians who live everywhere, but it also involves a lot of different people who are interested in the question of Palestine. So my view of it is quite big. I mean, if you're asking me to give you a very kind of quick, idea about Palestinian art in general, I would say that it's varied in form. I would say that it has been, like in recent years, it's become more and more critical of self-critical of the Palestinian realities, but also like there's a lot of, can I say bullshit? Yeah, also. Yeah, I mean, any kind of situation like Palestine produces a lot of also, I wish I had the book of Murid, because he says something about art in times of crisis, where people want very simplistic artworks. And I think, obviously if you've followed anything about Palestine, you'll know that that also exists. But yeah, I mean, but overall, I think we have a broad, we have different kinds of artists, which I find healthy. I think now more and more people are kind of discussing form with one another. I can see them responding to one another, which I think is quite good, which means we're not kind of like only stuck in terms of communicating ideas literally or for propaganda uses. Yeah.
Fantastic. Oslo, imagine something different. And placial, I like that. I think we're going to add that into the glossary. This could go on, and I'm sure it will in other spheres and other places.